Welcome to our video explaining a critical review of the arguments against the use of rubrics. We are Anders Johnson and myself, Ernesto Panadero. The story or the backstory of this review is actually quite interesting, so we decided to share it before we start explaining what we actually did in the review. Back in 2016, Anders and myself attended the early SIG #1 Assessment and Evaluation Conference in Munich. Back there, David Carles organized a symposium, which was a presentation of 3 of the chapters of a book he actually has published with some colleagues. Anders and myself were presenting a chapter that we wrote, and we were discussing the use of rubrics to support assessment for learning in higher education. In the time of the questions, after Anders' presentation, a lot of critique towards rubrics pop up. All of a sudden, people were considering that rubrics narrow the curriculum, rubrics make students focus on performance, not on learning, etc. And at some point, Phil Dawson, who was also a presenter in that symposium, actually named Anders and myself as the rubric guys, probably based on the fact that Anders has published a review back in 2007 with Gunilla, and Anders and myself published another review back in 2013. We already voiced that we were not sure that such critiques to rubrics actually had empirical evidence, but the conversation and the discussion get more and more heated, and instead of solving things out, we ended up leaving the symposium a little bit down. So we decided to go for a beer in Munich, which is something everyone should do. And while we were having the beer, we were having our notebooks and we were outlining a paper or review, it wasn't clear at that point, to counteract some of the things that we heard that afternoon. A couple of weeks later, I went to Australia, as you can imagine by the animals that we have here. I worked from Melbourne, from the Cradle team for 2 months, and one of the things that they asked me to do over there is to present the reflection about rubrics. And I prepared this presentation called Rubrics Are the Evil. And along the presentation, it was clear that this paper that Anders and myself were working on, it was really important. One of the anecdotes is that, as you know, or some of you know, the paper that finally got published some months back, it has a running working title, Rubrics Are the Evil. And the reason is we keep this title, but at the end we decided to have something less polemic. But Rubrics Are the Evil is coming from my presentation in Melbourne. Now, I will present what is the theoretical framework and the method that we use for this particular study. Here we explore the definition, design, and purposes of rubrics, including recommendations, the effects on student performance, how rubrics support student learning, and of course, criticism on the use of explicit criteria and rubrics. All in all, our aim was to scrutinize the claims made by the critics, and we did this investigating 3 research questions. We use a 3-method search. First, the usual database, then we use our own personal libraries, and finally we also ask 3 experts for their own reference libraries. We ended up with 26 journal articles plus 1 book, and because we wanted to be as inclusive as possible, we didn't use the peer review as a non-inclusion criterion. After content analysis, we had 93 excerpts identified, and then we performed a thematic analysis with those 93 excerpts. Also, in terms of searching for empirical evidence, we went up to 2 levels, which means if one of those original articles or publications cited another one, we went to that source. And at the same time, if that new source cited another one, we went to that up to the 2nd level. A 3rd level was never needed.
Thank you, Ernesto. I will now present the findings from this review. There are 2 parts in this section. First, what we did was to organize the critique into different themes. In the example shown here, there are different points of critique that could be categorized as belonging to the theme limitations of criteria and analytical assessments. In all, we found 5 main themes, as seen here on the screen. In addition to the thematic analysis, we also investigated what kind of empirical evidence the critics used to back up their arguments. Here we could see that the theme we called simple implementations don't work was backed up by empirical research, while in most cases the criticism was largely based on anecdotal evidence, theoretical speculations, or extrapolated from broader issues such as large-scale standardized testing. We also could see that a large number of claims were very deterministic, as can be seen from these examples using words such as necessary and impossible. Similarly, deterministic claims were made regarding how students react when informed about assessment criteria. Empirical studies, on the other hand, tend to show that students react differently when exposed to explicit criteria. In this study shown here, for instance, more than half of the students used the criteria as a support structure, rather than letting the criteria dictate their work. Although rubrics can be designed and used in a number of different ways, several critics argued from what we could call a worst-case scenario perspective, where rubrics necessarily focus on surface details, include quantifiable levels of performance, and so on. From these findings, we made some suggestions. First, we think that instead of being deterministic and thereby close the door for empirical investigations, we, as researchers, should investigate potential limitations of using rubrics and base our decision on such data rather than relying on personal experiences or anecdotal evidence. We also think that we should make distinctions between different purposes of using rubrics, how rubrics are actually used and how they are designed, instead of making assumptions about rubrics with this very narrow conceptualization of rubrics in mind. And finally, we think that instead of making the question of using rubrics a dichotomy, we should make students aware of the conditional nature of criteria and let criteria be indicators of quality without dictating exactly what students should do or how they should do it. Ernesto has also made a request on social media for questions to be answered here, but unfortunately there is no time to address all of these questions here. But I think that a lot of these questions about the use of rubrics may disappear if we see rubrics as a support structure, supporting our assessment decisions or our communication with students rather than something that dictates our assessment, our feedback, or students' work. Our professional judgment can never be reduced to or replaced by a list of criteria, but rubrics can remind us of aspects that may otherwise be forgotten or neglected. They can also provide a structure against which students can interpret their feedback, or providing a starting point for students to structure, monitor, or evaluate their work. This view of rubrics has several important implications. For example, rubrics can have a role to play in higher education, but not by replacing teachers' judgment. Instead, rubrics could be used in order to support teachers when communicating about expectations with students, when assessing student work, when providing feedback, and when discussing criteria and standards with other teachers. Furthermore, the idea of using rubrics being a charade, since teachers tend to fit their overall judgment into the rubric as a post hoc procedure, we think is based on a notion of either or, rather than seeing professional judgment and the use of rubrics as complementary. For example, if a holistic decision has to be made, rubrics can be used in order to ascertain that I have indeed taken all the relevant aspects into consideration when making my decision, even if it's based on an overall judgment. Similarly, rubrics can assist teachers in identifying strengths and shortcomings in student performance, which might otherwise have been overlooked, without necessarily limiting teachers' feedback to include only those criteria present in the rubric. This also means that the quality of the rubric is not quite as crucial as compared to situations where rubrics may overrule teachers' judgments. On the contrary, what we could call a half-baked rubric may sometimes provide more productive discussions, as the contents need to be negotiated with students or other teachers, which is seen in some studies. So, as Ernesto often claims, how we use this tool is probably more important than the tool itself. A perfectly designed rubric that is just handed out to the students will probably have less of an impact than a mediocre rubric implemented using scaffolding, modeling, opportunities for resubmission, etc. With this, I end this presentation. Thank you for your attention, and of course, if you want to know more, please read the full paper.